My name is Watson, and I live in a quiet, peaceful town where everyone knows everyone. It's the kind of place where neighbors greet each other with a friendly smile and people stop to chat as they pass by. I've always enjoyed hosting dinner parties at my house, bringing friends together, sharing good food, and having relaxed conversations. It's one of the things I look forward to most. But one summer evening, I hosted a dinner party that turned into a mystery that has haunted me ever since. The day of the party started just like any other. I spent hours preparing, setting the table with my best dishes, making sure everything was perfect. The house smelled of roasted chicken, freshly baked bread, and the warm, inviting aromas of a home-cooked meal. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow through the windows, and it felt like the perfect evening for a gathering. My closest friends were on their way: Sarah, Mark, Lisa, and John. They had all been part of my life for years, and it was always great to catch up with them. There was, however, a new face joining us, Tom. He had recently moved to town, and I thought it would be nice to include him in the group. Tom was a bit of a mystery. He was quiet and reserved, a man of few words, but I figured he'd settle in after a while. He seemed genuinely happy to be invited, and I hoped the evening would be a good one for him too. When everyone arrived, we all gathered around the table and started eating. The conversation flowed easily. There were jokes, laughter, and stories exchanged as we dug into the delicious food. Everyone was enjoying themselves, and I felt proud of how the evening was unfolding. After dinner, we moved to the living room to continue talking, settling into more casual conversations with dessert in hand. Tom, however, was acting a little strange. He seemed quiet, more so than usual. I thought maybe he was just shy, or maybe not feeling entirely comfortable. In a new town, I didn't think much of it at first, but as the evening wore on, I started to notice a change in his behavior. He became visibly tense, almost as if he was uncomfortable with the conversation or with being around people. His eyes kept darting around, avoiding contact with anyone. I noticed he wasn't participating in the discussion much, and when he did speak, his words seemed short and distant. It was unusual for him, but I didn't want to make a big deal of it. I figured maybe he was just having a bad day, or that he wasn't quite ready to open up. The night was starting to feel different, though. The energy had shifted, and the joy of the evening was beginning to fade. Eventually, Tom stood up abruptly. He muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't quite make out. I thought maybe he was going to the bathroom, but then he turned toward the door, his face expressionless, and said he needed to leave. Before any of us could say anything, the door slammed shut behind him. It happened so suddenly that none of us knew how to react. For a few moments, we all just sat there, stunned. We looked at each other, wondering what had just happened. It was so out of character for Tom. He had seemed fine at the start of the evening. After a few moments of awkward silence, we all tried to shake it off, but the mood had already shifted. We spent the rest of the evening in silence, the conversations dying down. I kept replaying the moment over and over in my mind. Why had Tom left so suddenly? Was something wrong? I couldn't help but feel concerned, but I didn't want to push the issue in front of everyone. The next day, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. I decided to check on Tom, hoping to find out what had upset him. When I got to his house, his car was parked in the driveway, but there was no answer. When I knocked on his door, I thought maybe he was out, or maybe needed some space. His absence seemed odd, but I figured it wasn't anything to worry about. Yet, as the days went by, I started to feel uneasy. I reached out to my friends to see if any of them had heard from him, but no one had seen or spoken to him. It was as if Tom had simply disappeared. After a few days, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong, so I decided to call the police and report him as missing. The officers took my statement and promised to investigate. They assured me that they would do everything they could to find him, but as time passed, nothing turned up. The police searched his house, spoke to his neighbors, and followed up on all leads. But Tom had vanished without a trace. It was like he had disappeared into thin air. Weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of Tom. His sudden disappearance became a topic of conversation among my friends, but we were all left with more questions than answers. I found myself going over the events of that night again and again, wondering if I had missed some clue, some sign that would explain why Tom had acted the way he did. Could I have done something to stop him from leaving? Was there something I should have noticed earlier? I couldn't help but feel responsible, and the guilt started to eat away at me. Determined to find out more, I began digging into Tom's past. I wanted to know who he was, what he had been through before he moved here. I learned that he had come to our town after a tough breakup, hoping to start fresh. He didn't have many friends, and his family lived far away. The more I learned about him, the more I realized how little I truly knew about the man. It was like he had been a stranger, despite living in our town for a while. One night I was alone in my house, thinking about everything that had happened, when I heard something outside. It was faint at first, just a rustling sound, like someone was moving through the bushes. My heart raced as I peeked out the window, but I saw nothing. The noise stopped, and I tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But then the noises continued. Footsteps, whispers, a feeling that someone was watching me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My nights became restless, my sleep disturbed, and I couldn't help but feel like something was out there, lurking in the darkness. It wasn't long before I found something in Tom's house, something the police had overlooked. I found an old journal buried under a pile of papers. As I flipped through it, I realized it was filled with his thoughts and fears. The entries started out normal, but as I read on, they became darker. He wrote about feeling out of place, not just in our town, but in life. He mentioned feeling like something was following him, watching him. The entries grew more paranoid. The last one, dated the night of the dinner party, read, "I can't escape it. It's always watching, always waiting. I need to leave before it's too late." Reading those words sent a chill down my spine. What had Tom been so afraid of? I shared the journal with the police, but it didn't provide any answers. The investigation went cold. As time passed, the memory of that night began to fade for everyone else, but I couldn't let it go. The unanswered questions gnawed at me. I still wondered if Tom was out there somewhere, lost and scared, or if something more sinister had happened to him. The guilt and confusion never left me. I kept searching, hoping for answers, but the mystery of Tom's disappearance remains unsolved. That dinner party, which had started as a joyful evening for everyone else, cast a long shadow over my life. It was a reminder that even the simplest moments could turn into the most inexplicable mysteries. In the quiet moments, when I'm alone with my thoughts, I still think of Tom and that fateful night. I wonder what really happened. His story is a ghost that haunts me, a mystery I may never fully understand, but I keep hoping that one day the truth will come to light and Tom's story will finally have an ending. Last September, my friends, and I decided to go for a night drive. We were bored and wanted an adventure. It was a cold, clear night, and the moonlight made the empty roads look mysterious. There were 4 of us in the car, me, Alex, Sam, and Jenny. We drove aimlessly, laughing and playing music. But soon the conversation turned to ghost stories. Someone mentioned an old abandoned house at the edge of town. We should go there, Sam suggested with a grin. The idea was thrilling and scary at the same time. We all agreed, and Alex, who was driving, turned the car in the direction of the house. The roads became narrower and bumpier as we got closer. Tall trees lined the path, their branches looking like twisted fingers in the moonlight. Finally, we saw it, the old abandoned house. It stood at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by overgrown bushes and tall grass. The house was large, with broken windows and a sagging roof. It looked like it had been empty for years. The car's headlights cast eerie shadows on the walls, making the house look even scarier. We parked the car a little way down the road, not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. As we walked towards the house, the air felt colder, and I could hear the sound of our footsteps crunching on the gravel. My heart was beating fast, and I could tell my friends were nervous too. We reached the front door, which was hanging off its hinges. Alex pushed it open with a creak, and we stepped inside. The air inside was musty and stale. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows on the dusty floor. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. We split up to explore. Jenny and I went upstairs, while Alex and Sam stayed on the ground floor. The stairs groaned under our weight as we climbed. Each step echoed through the empty house. Upstairs, we found old furniture covered in white sheets, broken picture frames, and cobwebs in every corner. It felt like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jenny and I moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. In one of the rooms, I found an old diary on a dusty table. I picked it up and opened it, but the pages were too faded to read. Suddenly, we heard a loud crash from downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. "Alex? Sam?" Jenny called out, but there was no answer. We hurried back down the stairs. The living room was empty, but the front door was now closed. We hadn't heard it shut. A sense of dread washed over me. Something wasn't right. "Let's find them and get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We moved through the house, checking each room. The kitchen was empty, and so was the dining room. As we entered the last room, a small storage space at the back of the house, we found Alex and Sam. They were standing still, staring at something on the floor. I followed their gaze and saw what they were looking at, a trapdoor. "Did you open it?" I asked. Sam shook his head. It was already open when we got here." A cold draft came up from the trapdoor, sending shivers down my spine. Darkness below seemed to swallow the light from our flashlights. Against my better judgment, we decided to go down. The narrow wooden ladder creaked as we descended into the basement. The basement was damp and cold. The walls were lined with shelves full of dusty jars and old tools. In the corner, there was a small flickering light. We cautiously approached it and found an old lantern hanging from a nail. In the wall, it cast a dim glow, barely illuminating the room. Suddenly, we heard footsteps above us. Someone else was in the house. My heart pounded in my chest. We turned off our flashlights and stood still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer to the trapdoor. We held our breath, hoping whoever it was would leave, but the footsteps stopped right above us. Then slowly, the trapdoor began to creak open. A figure appeared at the top of the ladder, silhouetted against the dim light from the living room. It was a man, tall and thin, with wild hair and eyes that seemed to glow in the dark. He climbed down the ladder, and we backed away, trying to stay out of his sight. The man moved slowly, methodically, as if he was searching for something. He muttered to himself, words we couldn't understand. I could feel my friends trembling beside me. We needed to get out of there, but the only way was past the man. Suddenly the man stopped and turned his head, looking directly at us. His eyes locked onto mine, and a cold smile spread across his face. He started walking toward us, and panic set in. We bolted for the ladder, scrambling up as fast as we could. Alex went first, followed by Jenny, then me, and finally Sam. As we reached the top, the man grabbed Sam's ankle, pulling him back down. Sam kicked and struggled, and we all grabbed him, pulling with all our strength. Sam managed to break free, and we slammed the trapdoor shut, locking it with a rusty bolt. We didn't stop to catch our breath. We ran out of the house through the front door and back to the car. We jumped in, and Alex started the engine. The tires screeched as we sped away, not looking back. As we drove away, the house disappeared into the darkness behind us. We didn't speak, too shaken by what had just happened. The thrill of the night drive had turned into a nightmare. We had found our adventure, but it was one we would never want to repeat. From that night on, we never spoke of the abandoned house again. The memory of the man and his eerie smile haunted me for weeks. Even now, when I drive past the edge of town, I feel a chill and speed up, not wanting to be reminded of that terrifying night. When I was real young, and even dumber than I am now, I used to believe just about everything. My granny would tell me, and she told me a whole lot of stuff that she probably ought not to have. She was a real religious kind of woman, and she loved to try to scare me and my sister with stories of devils and demons and other evil things to make us be good and behave. But she always told this one story that didn't fit with the others. Funny thing is, I've never heard this story nowhere but from her, so it might do well to post it online to let others hear it. Anyhow, she used to swear up and down that there was some sort of devil or other nasty thing that could disguise itself as someone else. She said it wasn't too good at it, though, and you could always tell something was off. Now, my nephew told me about skinwalkers and the like, and he said this might be a bit similar, but there are some pretty big differences. I think, firstly, my granny said that whatever this thing was, it weren't human in the slightest. Wasn't some sort of witch or nothing, just something else entirely. She told me she didn't know what it really looked like neither, under that disguise and all. She told me that after her second husband died, about 2 weeks after the funeral, she got a knock at her door in the middle of the night in the dead of winter during a nasty snowstorm. She said she opened that door and there stood Hoyt, her second husband. She said at first that really thought it was him, but after he stepped into the light of the house, she knew something was off with him. She told me he looked sagoglin, which means built funny or crooked. I didn't know what that word meant back then, though, so that sort became the name of the thing. She said the first thing that was off about him were his eyes being just a touch too far apart, not to any extreme degree, but just enough that it put her off. Then she said his skin was a hell of a lot smoother and less wrinkly than he was when he died. He was damn near 90, and she said he looked at least 10 years younger that night. She got real anxious, like, when she started noticing all this stuff. That didn't add up, and add to that the fact that she buried him 2 weeks before, and she started panicking real hard. She said Hoyt reached up with both his hands and started telling her, "Don't worry, honey," but his voice wasn't right neither. She said it sounded like it hurt him to talk, like there was a groaning just behind his voice, and his lips didn't match up neither. She told my brother and me that it started to look more like someone put on a bad mask of Hoyt and was wearing it around. She says she'd never been scarred in her whole life, so she started pushing him and hitting on him with both her fists, and that woman was feisty as hell, so I'm sure she did some damage. She said his skin was cold when his hands touched her, but it was cold that night and snowing hard, so I guess that makes sense. After she beat on him a little, the thing stepped back and started making noises she ain't ever heard before. She said it was like a low growl or a moan and compared it to a heavy old door opening real slow, like she'd always try and make the noise herself and get all choked up. Anyhow, she shut the door on the thing, and she said it just stood there for about an hour before it walked back into the woods. She lived in a holler about 20 miles from any town, and her neighbors were all snowed in like her, so she couldn't call for help. Said she was the scariest she'd ever been that night. She told us that the thing ain't always the same person, but can switch around and use new disguises when it wants to. She said that that's the only time she ever seen it herself, but heard stories from her own Meemaw about it. Funny thing is, about a month before she died, I went to gas station on the way home from work real late. When I got inside, there was a guy at the counter just standing there all stiff like the cashier was asking him to move. So he could help me, but the fellow wouldn't budge. Finally, the guy turned to me, and I got a good look at his face. His skin was all rubbery and fake looking, and I couldn't really tell which was his eyes were facing, since they almost looked like two marbles, all dry and not wet like a normal eyeball. After I paid for my gas, the guy followed me out without saying as much as a word. It made me real uncomfortable, but at first I thought it was someone down on their luck. But when I climbed back in my truck, I looked over to him and asked him if he needed help. He looked at me with those dry-looking eyes and said, "All good," with that same creaky voice my granny used to tell us about. Told her that story in the hospital the next night, and she put her finger on my forehead and said, "Now you seen it too." And I felt real strange about it. Maybe that guy at the gas station was the Sagoglin like my granny said, but he won't dressed up as Hoyt that night, so who knows. Anyhow, I hope you liked this little story. Always gave me the heebie-jeebies. And maybe this is a good time to tell others about it. Over the health, there was an ancient crumbling water house where the entire estate's water system was managed. Believe me, we thought it was a miracle. How anything that old and manky could keep and pump out any water, but it did. It was made with bricks, with a black slate roof and iron doors, although at the time of this incident, it was just a shadow of its former self and didn't have any doors. The windows were all smashed in by generations of kids throwing rocks and stones at them. It was there where my mama and her siblings were kids played over the heath, and they all told us it spooked them and their mates as it did us. It was a really hot day one summer in the school holidays. The older boys were at home for some reason, and all the younger cousins, me included, were being little brats. So the boys said they would take us all blackberry picking to keep us quiet. Mama agreed gratefully. The boys were really responsible and mature at 16, 17, and 18. They babysat for us younger kids all the time. So we all knew the rules of staying close to the boys and doing what they told us. And so a half hour later, everyone had their fruit buckets and we were off. There were 5 of us younger kids. We were all really excited, as blackberry picking was a great family favorite activity, and our Gran's blackberry pies were the best. Gran's house led directly onto the back of the heath. There was a fence with a gap at the end. One of my older cousins passed me through to the other, then lifted my tiny wheelchair over the fence. The other kids were through in seconds, and We were away again, on our way to our destination. The older boys told us spooky stories, as they always did, half because they liked scaring us, and a half because we all used to beg them to. There was nothing more terrifying than a story from my cousins H or B. They were masters and so believable. We loved it. We all stopped talking when we came to the waterhouse. Nobody ever dared to speak around or near the waterhouse, not even the older boys. For something so mundane, it always looked, and still does, so eerie. There was a second fence to get through before we reached our beloved blackberry field D. But this time, as we squeezed through the gap of the fence, we were all more somber, as we remembered the old wife's tale urban legend that we all knew about the waterhouse. The story goes, once in the early 1960s, there was a gang of bank robbers. They were local to the area and were really nasty pieces of work. Their expertise was terrorizing bank customers and staff alike before grabbing and shooting anything that moved. They did several jobs without getting caught, but they really messed up a particular job, and a sweet 19-year-old trainee bank clerk was shot dead and 5 more people were seriously injured. One of the gang was also shot dead, along with the nastiest member of the gang being seriously wounded in the crossfire. It is said that the remaining gang members escaped with just a few hundred and made their way over to the heath and hid out in the waterhouse. It was newish at that time and was a perfect hideaway for the murderers. There was a lot of contention and stress between the remaining gang. Months, although it was never proven how, the bodies of all 3 of the remaining gang members were discovered rotting away in the waterhouse 6 months later, a few years after the weird stuff, and creepy noises started occurring near and around the waterhouse. Mysterious hairy figures were glimpsed, moving stealthily amongst the pipes and wires. A dank, moldy, rotten smell like aging river. Weeds was always smelt around the area of the waterhouse, and eerie wails and menacing murmurs could be heard day and night. In the late 70s, there was a spate of mysterious deaths of homeless people who would shelter over the heath not too far from the waterhouse. There was nothing to ever link the deaths to the waterhouse, but the locals soon started giving the waterhouse and surrounding area a wide berth because of the creepy history and dark reputation, and that left the waterhouse abandoned and in disrepair. That's what we knew of the waterhouse's dark history. That is why we were so wary and anxious to get away from it as quickly as possible. When we were all through the gap in the fence, further away from the waterhouse, us younger cousins built up enough courage to glance over at the building of ill repute before being rounded up by the older boys, put me in my wheelchair again, and we set off to the blackberry field. We soon arrived at the field where some other local kids we knew were already there, and we spent a nice afternoon picking and eating the juicy, sweet blackberries and splashing in the river, and soon the sun was getting low, and it was time for home. Our journey home was much like the one there. We were still bantering, laughing, and the older boys were still winding us up slightly, but being as it was getting later, we were feeling wearier and slightly subdued. When we reached the fence, before the waterhouse, the air felt slightly too close, like before a thunderstorm. The youngest of the 3 older boys got me out of my wheelchair so that B could lift it over the fence. The other kids were already on the other side of the fence with H and B. A suddenly said to his brother in a low, guarded voice, "Something moved at the back of their groove." B just looked at him sideways. Out of the boys, A was the most likely one to pull a stunt or wind anyone up for a laugh. But A was straight-faced. A said, "I'm going to have a look," passing me through to B and squeezing past us all. "Wait up, we've got to," having put me in my wheelchair. B had moved forward towards his brother, when we all heard A shriek out in horror and disgust, and the 2 boys moved back. Quickly, H, having already taken me out of my wheelchair, again had told everyone to run, and we did. B picking up my tiny wheelchair, folding it up while running, A grabbing the other 2 kids' hands, and following B and H running with me on his shoulders, holding my other cousin's hands. We ran and ran. I kept saying, "Don't look back. Don't look back." I did, but saw nothing. We didn't stop till we got to the fence, which leads back to the road on the estate, and we could actually see civilization again. We were all completely exhausted, especially the older boys. Before we slipped through the fence to the road, B, holding himself up by the railings, asked, "What did you see, A?" With yellow eyes. H, hairy face. All of us younger kids began to panic and scream, and H had to calm us all down. He said that we were safe, and it would be all right, but we all wanted to get as far away from the water house as possible. When we got home, we all looked bedraggled and slightly nervy. Mama and my auntie noticed this and asked the boys what was wrong. H just said that we just got spooked by an old drunk man in the bushes looking for golf balls to sell, and as that was quite commonplace over the heath, Mama and my auntie just gave us kids a pep talk and hugged us. We never did tell my mama or my auntie the truth about the yellow eyes and hairy face or find out what it actually was, but us kids didn't go near the water house for a long time after. My big brother used to have an imaginary brother, and he would always play with him, but sometimes he would say, "Stop, leave me alone," or "No, I don't want to go to my room to play." My mom would ask him, "What's going on?" And he would say, "He won't leave me alone." Of course, my mom had no idea what he was talking about and thought it was just him being a kid with an imaginary friend. Well, a day after my brother's birthday, he had these balloons, and keep in mind my brother is just a little kid, and he's obviously not tall, so he couldn't reach the plates, knives, forks, etc. It was around 10-11 p.m., and my mom heard the balloons pop, so she went outside, and my brother looked really scared. So my mom asked him, "What's happened? Did you pop the balloons?" And my brother said, freaking out, no, it was him, pointing to his imaginary friend that my mom obviously couldn't see. My mom saw the knife next to the balloons and immediately knew that he was too short to reach any of those things. So she said, "Get out of my house," to my brother's imaginary friend. Since my mom couldn't see him, she asked my brother if he left already, and he said he had left and thanked my mom. Later, about 10-15 minutes later, my cousins came over, and my cousin said that he saw a woman in all white with her hair in front of her face in the front door. My brother said that that was his mom, and she opened the door. My cousins were already inside and asked my brother if she was still there, and my brother said yes and that she was mad. She started to yell for her to get out, and then she asked my brother if she was still here, and he said no. My brother is now 19 and says he still sometimes sees him in his mirror. It all started with a dream. I was in a house. It wasn't my own, but it felt familiar somehow. It was late at night, but I didn't know how late as the clocks appeared blurry. Then the hair on my neck stood up, like I was being watched, and my heart started racing. I looked around to find the source of my fear and only saw a couch and a TV playing late-night talk shows. But wait, what was that dark shadow rushing past the window? I started running upstairs. As I ran, I saw photos on the wall that looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't tell why. I ran into a bathroom and closed the door and locked it behind me. Out of breath, I started gasping for air. Then I saw a dark shape out the window, a dark shape that seemed to be writhing and pulsing down its entire body. I screamed, and just as soon as I could blink, it burst through the bathroom window and stood in front of me. It looked at me with its beady eyes, and I saw why it was pulsing. It was made out of thousands, maybe millions, of bugs and spiders all crawling along a general humanoid shape. It opened its mouth, and hundreds of cockroaches came rushing out like opening a floodgate. They ran down its body across the floor and up my body into my mouth and nose. I could feel all of the thin legs walking across my tongue and down my throat until I couldn't breathe anymore. I suffocated and right. As I was losing consciousness, I saw the creature bring up its hand and clench it into a fist, and all the cockroaches came back out of my body and scurried underneath the long black cloak the monster was wearing. I woke up shortly after, terrified yet intrigued. The creature reminded me of an old tale that my late grandmother had told me when I was younger. I could still hear her cold, shrill voice as it was those many years ago. Now, young boy, let me tell you a story from the fatherland, a story that has frightened me since I was a little girl. It is the story of the Nachtpirscher. They say it is a tall beastie, 7 feet in size, a creature made of only bugs and creepy crawlies. They say it is a sign of bad things to happen. To any of those to dream of its image, if one is to dream of the Nachtpirscher, their lives will be destroyed forever. My grandmother was a German immigrant who had recently died. Maybe that's why I had dreamed the creature, my subconscious associating bad things happening with the Nachtpirscher. I didn't think much of the dream. I turned on the TV in my living room and saw a news update. Tony Sherwood, who was a good friend of mine, had died last night. I was devastated and called into my job and explained the situation, and they let me have a day off to cope. I went to his family's house to offer my condolences, and I spent the rest of the day with his family telling stories about Tony, trying to remember him the best we could. So we all had a good idea of what kind of person he was. The next night I had a dream much like the previous one. However, now I was in a different home. I could still feel the presence of something evil and ran, but this time the creature was faster. It was in front of me. Before I made it out of the room, as if it learned from a previous encounter, I fell to the floor in terror and watched as it opened its mouth. Except this time, instead of cockroaches, it was black widow spiders crawling out towards me. I felt as they bit my throat and crawled into my lungs. I could barely breathe, and then they crawled out of my mouth and back into the creature's robes. I watched in horror as it stretched its fingers out and touched my face. I thought I even saw a tear run down its face as I slipped into death deprived of oxygen. Before the darkness started, I willed myself to wake up, disgusted and horrified with my own imagination. But when I woke up, I saw my own mother laying at my feet, unconscious. I looked around and I was in my mother's home. I thought back to my past dream and realized that I had been in Tony's house. I had been seeing two disgusting, terrifying, and truly horrible murders from the perspectives of the victims. And I was the killer. I was the Nachtpirscher.